I want to invite you to watch this interview of Bart Ehrman as I point out the flaws and errors in his reasoning.
We should get into talking about Jesus, though. And before we start, I do want to have a quick caveat right at the beginning to say that we're not talking about mythicism.
You're right. We don't want to talk about mythicists today, except to say that there are people who say that he didn't even exist.
I am a proud mythicist, but I was not always a mythicist. I was a Christian for 30 years, but when I looked at the origins of Christianity, mythicism was the answer.
It's the idea that Jesus himself is a myth, and that's not an issue that's seriously debated among experts in the field, but who are New Testament scholars.
And that is why scholars have done the world a huge disservice by taking an indefensible position based on an assumption and then shutting down debate, essentially stifling the advancement of knowledge.
But they are nonetheless very concerned about knowing what kind of evidence do we have for Jesus, not just his existence, kind of, because the evidence for what he said and did, of course, is evidence for his existence.
Oh, the dishonesty. Bart just said the evidence for what Jesus said and did is evidence for his existence. But yet you will soon find out that Bart does not accept the evidence for what Jesus said and did.
But the fact that we have sources that are, all the sources agree he existed, but still that doesn't help you much knowing who he was and what did he teach and what did he do and what happened to him. And so it's really important for people to understand what kind of sources of information we have for all of that. And that's a topic that scholars have really wrestled with for a very long time.
So if the scholars wrestle with the fact of whether or not the sources for Jesus are historical and reliable, why do they shut down the debate against people who are saying that the sources for Jesus are not historical or reliable? It's purely dishonest.
So when we're trying to determine whether a person actually existed, and we have to rely on historical data, but what data do we have from the ancient world concerning Jesus?
Well, we have a lot more than for 99.99% of the rest of the population.
That's Bart's nervous laugh when he realizes he's making an extremely weak argument. The reason there are more things written about Jesus is not because he was a historical figure, but because he was a mythical superhero used to create a new Greek religion. And people wrote many different conflicting stories about Jesus, their superhero, and not a single person who ever wrote about Jesus ever met Jesus.
Jesus would have been living in the first century of the Common Era. And so say the first 30 years. And in those years, we know about, outside of the Bible, we have very little information about any of them. But in the case of Jesus, we have records. We don't have contemporary records. We don't have, in other words, people who knew Jesus at the time didn't leave us any writings about him. People who knew Jesus at the time didn't leave us any writings about him. But nonetheless, we do have sources of information far beyond what we do for most people.
How much of a problem is the fact that we don't have contemporary records for Jesus? Obviously, we'd all prefer for there to be some kind of census, maybe, that has his name and place of birth and family ties and all that kind of thing. But we don't. Is this a problem for ascertaining who he was and indeed whether he actually existed?
It's not so much a problem for whether he existed because of things we will get into once we get around to talking about those mythicists, but because we have so many records from so many independent sources that it's pretty clear he existed. I mean, and one of our sources is in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who actually knew Jesus' brother. I mean, so, if Jesus didn't exist, you think his brother would know it.
Surely the Bible is telling the truth when it says Paul met Jesus' brother. There's no way that could be a lie, right?
Paul knows some of Jesus' disciples, and he just mentions them casually. He's not mentioning them in order to prove there was a Jesus. He's just, he's mentioning them. And so it's not an eyewitness, Paul. Paul didn't know Jesus during his lifetime, but he knew people who did know Jesus, and he met with them, he talked with them, spent time with them.
Bart, either accept the Christian narrative or identify it as unreliable propaganda.
It's a very big problem that we don't have contemporary records if we want to know exactly what he said and did.
Oh, so now it's a very big problem that we can't know what Jesus said or did because we don't have contemporaneous eyewitness testimonies, but yet that is the very thing that gives you and your scholarly friends the confidence that he at least existed.
Our primary sources of information are the Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are written between 40 and 60 years after his death.
This is a good example of how you cannot trust a scholar simply because they are a scholar. I have seen evidence that suggests that the Gospel of Luke was not written until the late 2nd century, and the Gospel of Matthew was written after that, possibly in the 3rd century.
They pose a lot of problems for scholars, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not know they were writing the Bible. They weren't writing scripture. They were writing accounts of Jesus that they had heard and read, and that had been in circulation for years. That is both a plus and a minus. The plus is it means that there are all sorts of stories floating around about Jesus in lots of parts of the world by the time these guys are writing. And so it shows that there are independent lines of transmission going out with these oral traditions, and historians love to have independent lines of transmission of about somebody, because if they're independent lines, they haven't been based on each other.
First of all, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not written by anyone named Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Christians attributed these names to these Gospels because it would be embarrassing to Christians to leave them anonymous as they truly were. Secondly, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not independent lines of transmission. They are dependent on each other. They used each other as a source, and they modified the parts that they liked or didn't like to suit their narrative. And thirdly, the truly independent lines of transmission about the Jesus story, the Gnostic text, and all these other things, they simply present contradictions and conflicts that cannot be reconciled, and it muddies the water to the point that there is no way to know if any of these things were true. And they were all written by people who were not even eyewitnesses to anything.
You have to treat them as historical sources written by people who did not imagine that they were writing scripture. They were just writing their accounts. And so they're just as valuable as historical sources as any other historical source.
Therein lies Bart's number one faulty assumption. He says you must treat the Gospels as a reliable historical narrative instead of mythology or propaganda, yet he throws out most of what the Gospels say because he thinks it's not true.
So when we're looking at the Gospels, then how far can we trust them as historical sources? There are contradictions and obviously very legendary mythical elements to them. You think about the miracles that get reported. Matthew and Luke give two conflicting reports of Jesus' birth. So how do we, when we're faced with evidence like that, how do we decide which is closest to historical fact, what is maybe legend that built up around Jesus after his death?
Yeah, since the Enlightenment, scholars have realized that the Gospels are not objective biographical accounts of what Jesus really said and did.
Can you see how ridiculous Bart's position is? In one sentence, he will say we have to treat the Gospels as historical narrative, and then immediately in the next sentence, he will say we know that the Gospels are not historical narrative.
For some of the reasons you're mentioning. When you compare the Gospels to each other, there are discrepancies and contradictions, a lot of them in minor details, lots and lots in minor details that are just flat out contradictions. And but in other places that are really fairly major events about Jesus' life that are reported quite differently in ways that cannot be reconciled if you look at them closely enough. Most people don't look at them closely, of course. They just kind of read them over quickly and say, yeah, that's saying basically the same thing. And that's fine. But when you actually look at the details, they're quite different. These books are written by people who did not know Jesus, who did not live in Israel, who didn't speak Jesus' language, Aramaic. They were Greek speakers, and they're basing their accounts on oral traditions, stories about Jesus that have been in circulation for many years, and stories get changed when they get told and retold and retold and retold. So those are all the downsides of the Gospels. And your question is then, well, what do you do about it? I mean, how do you, is there anything reliable there, and how do you know? And that of course is the big issue that scholars have wrestled with for many years.
So Bart knows the Gospels are unreliable. He just won't admit it. Bart knows that the Gospels were not written by any eyewitness, that the people who wrote the Gospels didn't even speak the same language that Jesus supposedly spoke, and that the only way the Gospels could even exist is if it was carried down from generation to generation by word of mouth to people who could not verify if anything they were being told was true.
So one of the things that historians look for when they're trying to understand an historical event is multiple sources, like you said, independent streams of transmission. You've said that we do have these independent streams for Jesus' existence, and I wanted to ask about the Gospels specifically. Given that Matthew and Luke are written using the Gospel of Mark as a base, do we count them as three distinct sources, or are they more properly considered as a single witness?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes and yes. So the deal is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar to each other, as you point out. The scholars have long called them the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means to be able to be seen together, and it's because they tell many of the same stories, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The stories are usually in the same sequence. First, this happened, then this, and this, and this. There are lots of changes too, but the basic skeleton is very much similar, and sometimes they tell them in the same words, word for word the same.
I see. Thank you very much. So you mentioned earlier that the Gospels date to several decades after Jesus' death. They don't always agree with each other, and some cases are a little bit light on the details. What can we say with any kind of certainty about the life of Jesus?
And so this is where the rubber really meets the road, because what scholars do is the people who are really serious scholars on this, of whom there are many who have spent their entire lives just on this question. Smart people who can not just read the Greek of the New Testament, but they usually understand Aramaic, and they know Hebrew for the Old Testament, and they know scholarship in French and German and Italian. And they spend their lives studying all this stuff. Like, this is what they study. And what scholars do is they look at a range of, they basically go line by line through all of our sources. The Gospels in the New Testament, Gospels outside the New Testament, the things that Paul says, the things mentioned in other sources of various kinds, and they evaluate every possible datum, and they do this in order to try and establish both the basic contours of Jesus' life, what he stood for, what he represented, what he basically preached, but also down to the details. Did he say this? Did he say that? Did he do this thing? Did he do that thing? And they apply a number of criteria that are comparable to what historians do for every field. I mean, anybody who's studying Thomas Jefferson does the same thing, or Julius Caesar or Charlemagne. You take the sources and you apply critical criteria to them. And so one of the criteria is the one that we mentioned just now, the independent attestation. But another one that's important for understanding historical Jesus is when you realize that the people telling stories about Jesus are telling these stories precisely because they're trying to proclaim something important about him. They tend to be Christians. If they say something that is really the kind of thing they'd want to preach anyway, you're not quite sure if that goes back to Jesus or not, because it may be somebody made this up, in order to develop his own views. But if you got something that actually, man, nobody would make that up about Jesus, because that doesn't make him look good. Or that introduces a real problem for early Christians. Christians would not have wanted to invent that one. If you have something like that, then you think, yeah, well, okay, that one's probably, that probably is historical then, because nobody would have made it up.
So that's a super long answer to say, I'm a scholar. Just trust me.
And so you have these various kinds of criteria that you would use for any historical figure that you use for Jesus. And when you do that, then the question is, what can you say about him? There are some things that I would say, 99% of everyone who studies this intently would agree on. I mean, basically, Jesus was from Galilee. He was of the northern part of what we think of as Israel. Came from a small town named Nazareth. He was lower class. He was he became a teacher. He left home to engage in an itinerant preaching ministry. He had people who followed him around, who thought that he was a very important teacher, possibly a prophet, possibly a Messiah. The last week of his life, he went to Jerusalem to proclaim his message, and he got on the wrong side of the law and apparently offended Jewish authorities there, and was turned over to Roman authorities, who considered him a troublemaker and had him crucified for claiming to be the future king of the Jews.
So Bart's scholarly opinion is that you should strip away all the supernatural events and all the miracles attributed to Jesus and realize that he was simply a regular human who was a Jewish teacher who was killed, and he accomplished nothing worthwhile, which means there would be no reason for anyone to write about him. So Jesus was either the miracle worker that the Bible claims that he is, or these Christian narratives are mythology. Those are your only options. Either believe it or reject it.
Is it odd that we don't have contemporary references to Jesus? So even if most people were illiterate, which I think is a well-agreed fact, if there was an itinerant preacher wandering around the wilderness causing unrest, would we not expect the Roman authorities to write about him, or is this our modern sensibilities of?
Yeah, I think that is a modern sensibility, because it just kind of makes common sense to us that if somebody is an important figure, they'll make the newspapers, and the newspapers will be around for centuries, and so it all makes sense to us. It didn't work that way in the ancient world. We don't have contemporary records about most anyone in the ancient world. I mean, you just think, for example, who would have been the most important Jewish figure from the time, well, let's say from the first century.
Who was the most important Jewish figure from the first century? It's got to be Jesus, right?
The most important Jewish figure for us for the first century, for historians, is the Jewish author Josephus.
Oh, you meant actual historical figure instead of a mythical figure.
Josephus was a historian who was very involved in the Jewish uprising in 66 to 70 that ended up to the destruction of the temple. He was a leader of Jewish troops there. He ended up being captured by the Romans and eventually was made a court historian by the Roman Emperor Vespasian. And he wrote a bunch of books that are our best sources of information about first century Judaism and for the history of Judaism in the period. He was a high upper class elite aristocrat, very involved, very important in the history of Israel at the time, who is our most important author.
And Josephus didn't say a single word about Jesus or Christianity in anything that he actually wrote. The Christians knew this was a problem for them, so they added the Testimonium Flavianum to Josephus in the 4th century, most likely written by Eusebius. If the Gospels were reliable historical records, then Josephus would have mentioned Jesus and Christianity, but he didn't.
You think about Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate would have been the most powerful figure in Jesus' day. He in Judea, he was the governor for 10 years between 26 and 36 CE. Now, we do have a couple of sources from his time, but they're not written sources per se. We have one inscription that was discovered that refers to Pontius Pilate, and that was discovered in the 1960s, just a stone slab in Caesarea. And so it does mention his name and says he was a prefect. And we do have some coins. But if you talk about like were other people writing about him, there's no written record of him in the first century at all. And he was the most important figure in Judea at the time.
That's just a bold-faced lie. Philo of Alexandria and Josephus wrote about Pontius Pilate in the 1st century.
So the idea that you don't have writings about Jesus uh, should not be used as an argument about anything, because about whom do we have written records from Israel at the time? No one, basically. So,
Thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful summary of how we use ancient sources as best we can, even though they might not be the sources that we would like if we could wave a magic wand and just have whatever we needed.
I mean, it's hard for us today to establish what leading politicians actually said. I mean, are you watching MSNBC or Fox News? I mean, which, and these are contemporary sources the next day, and it's very difficult sometimes. I mean, if you have a recording, that helps. Not always, though, as it turns out. But and so if you're dealing with antiquity, there's a lot more uncertainty. But Christians don't like the uncertainty when it comes to Jesus. But we're in the same boat, only we're actually in a more difficult boat with Jesus. But that kind of uncertainty just comes with the territory when you're dealing with the ancient world.
The evidence for Jesus is extremely weak, and Bart knows it. I wrote a book to document the research that I did that led me out of Christianity after 30 years of being a believer. And if you want to know the truth, then you need to read my book with an open mind and an honest heart in search for the truth. You don't want to be duped into believing Greek mythology and to think that your eternal destination is dependent on whether you believe this Greek story or not. Read Jesus Demigod, Putting the Lord on Trial by Jeff Mitchell on Amazon.